Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's instalment of Remote Agile London. First things first, some of you with some of my regulars and with a sharp eye, you've noticed I've moved bedrooms. I was originally in the kitchen, but my fiance was moaning at me because I was too close to the fridge and getting in the way when we were making lunch and dinner. So I'm now put into one of the bedrooms, and as you can see, this is my my new working home. So thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to you all. Just want to go over a couple of house rules. Some of you will have heard these before. Again, I do so every week. I sound like a broken record, but it really does help with the smoothness and the fluidity of the event. So can I just please ask that everyone remains on mute throughout the whole session? And I do actively encourage questions. I really do want them to come in, but can I ask that the questions are privately messaged to me, and then I will ask them to our speakers at the end of the event, because it really helps with everyone being able to hear the question being asked, and two, creates the platform and allows our speakers to deliver the answer that we all want to hear. So yeah, thank you for joining us. We've had some really great success with these meetups, and I've got one every single Wednesday until I believe the 16th of December. So firstly, a big thank you to everyone for joining this evening, and a big thank you to our two speakers for the evening. So we have Christopher Bramley speaking first. He's a coach, advisor, and a TEDx speaker. And then following Christopher's talk, we have Stan Wade, who is Head of Agile Innovation for IndigoBlue. So Christopher, his talk this evening is Uncertainty Needs a Compass, Not a Map. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Christopher. Over to you.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Yeah, just a quick introduction. So as said, I work with Agile, Lean, and various other frameworks. I work with complexity and I work with human learning. So a big core of this is collaboration and dealing with things in a world that isn't actually very ordered. So that's uncertainty, and that's a very large part, of course, of what we're dealing with these days. Hopefully everyone can see. Can everyone see the slides, hopefully?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So, and as mentioned, I'm a TEDx speaker on collaboration. If you really need to find something to send you to sleep, you can always go and have a look at that. And we talk about, a number of these things. Uncertainty is a very large part of this. And if I just pop to my next slide, the idea behind this, of course, is the fact that we love to be comfortable in things. Humans are very strange. We love to have comfort and convenience, although out of all the creatures on the planet, we are one of the best. We excel at change and being able to adapt and accept, which is repurpose stuff that we already have. Like, humans are exceptionally good at this. The problem is when the landscape changes, a map is no longer of any use, right? Because it's not fit for purpose anymore. So what you actually need then is a compass, is kind of a way to pick a direction and then move to it. Like, the old second star to the right and straight on till morning. If you like Star Trek, that's an old Kirk quote, but actually it comes from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, right? So when we feel in crisis, when we feel adrift, we're uncertain or whatever, our experience can't solve stuff because there's no context for it, right? So any action which gives direction can be modified via feedback. So one of the reasons that we are particularly bad at dealing with uncertainty is actually because of the way that we try to calculate it, right? This is a technical bit and I'm not going to spend too long on it. We believe in being robust. We believe in fail-safes. We believe in a number of these things, and they do not work in complex scenarios where there is uncertainty or chaotic scenarios. There's no order, there's no causality. So uncertainty challenges robustness, right? But what we do need when we are faced with uncertainty is the idea of resilience. Okay, so looking at the Gaussian distribution on the left here, you can see it's ordered and prepared for. It's found in causal systems. You've got, low probability, high impact events. You've got this bell curve which things fall in. This is typical risk assessment stuff. But when you look at nature and you look at the frequency of events and the magnitude of events, you actually get what's called a Pareto distribution, which is quite a linear line. It's called a power law, right? And what this is doing is saying that, look, there are so many things that could possibly happen. You can't stop things happening in uncertainty. You cannot prepare for every single hypothesis because there are so many, you literally can't imagine all of them. And once you understand that, you realize that the bell curve is different from where you think, and low probability events are probably going to be medium probability, right? This is saying to you, things will go wrong at some point. You cannot prepare for everything. So what's better to prepare for? To be robust, where a fail-safe will break eventually. Think of a seawall, for example. That's very, very strong, but if it breaks, it's catastrophic, and they do degrade. Or a salt marsh, resilience, the ability to buffer and soak something up. Okay, so I'm going to talk about agility and resilience as ways of dealing with uncertainty. And this is true personally and in business. If you're a company, if you're software development or you're military or whatever it happens to be, there are a number of ways you can manage this. So the two core things that I believe ultimately are required are agility. Now, when you're in any environment, you are given what are called affordances, right? This is what the environment offers an animal, i.e. in this case, us. And to be able to deal with that, agility requires you to be able to change, to repurpose, or to respond, right? So that's adapt, accept, and react. And response is slightly different from reaction, but I won't go into that now. But linked to that is this idea that I've just spoken about of resilience, right? So when we are resilient to things, we can detect weak signals early and possibly try to avoid failure. And that's not preparing for everything, that's seeing what we're being told, which is a different thing. Recovering quickly if we do fail, and then being able to exploit new pathways or goals from that, right? So this is where you start getting into things like complexity theory, complex adaptive systems theory, and Kinevin and so on. It links into Agile and a number of other ways of dealing with things. But the core concept of this is the ability of humans to learn quickly when presented with new information. So instead of pre-categorizing what is happening to us based on experiences that are not contextual, we are allowing the data we're presented with to present us with patterns that we then read, right? So it emerges from the data, answers emerge from the data. One of the ways that we best share information and that we best deal with uncertainties is actually stories and narratives. We actually share data and information much better informally than we do formally. I believe in IBM there was a study run showing in the technical departments a 64-to-1 ratio of retained information between informal discussions, water cooler if you like, and formal synchronous discussions. It's very interesting. Humans are storytellers, right? And this is what's called an assemblage, okay? An assemblage is a bunch of stories that have come together with no creator. The hero story that we always hear, the story of the underdog, these are assemblages. Stories of uncertainty are stories we all share, we all possess, and so that's an assemblage that we share. And you get this me becomes we, which is something I said in the TEDx, which essentially is where we are sharing these stories and we can learn from how we all dealt with uncertainty. The trick is not to try to template that, but to learn from it and then contextually develop our own way using that information. The core of being able to do that with stories, of course, is relationships. And there are four basic foundations, in my opinion. You have a form of love or respect, you have honesty, you have trust, and you have communication, because without communication, you cannot have the others. You cannot sustainably keep a relationship, I don't believe, if you don't have all of those things. And there are a number of other things that kind of fall into those, right? So stories are a really good way to share that. And this is the idea, I love the idea of kintsugi. I don't know if you're familiar with kintsugi, but it's the idea of the fact that we are going to fail. We will be broken at some time, whether it's business, whether it's personally, whatever it is, we will experience failure. And hiding that and pretending it didn't happen is not to our advantage, right? It's okay not to be okay. Accepting that is the beginning of resilience, and you can use that failure as a unique part of your beauty moving forward, right? It's part of you, part of your organization. You've learned from it and you've moved forward. We then have the idea of how humans come together. So we come together to order the world around us. And we love complicated or clear situations in complexity theory. Those are the domains of order, essentially. What we often fail to admit is that there are situations that cannot be ordered. They are dispositional. They don't have causality. You can guess what will happen, but you cannot predict it. And anybody who runs a business and then goes home to children knows exactly what I'm talking about, because children are not ordered creatures. You can tell them, if you have a children's party, Dave Snowden of Cognitive Edge has a great example. He says, do you sit them in a room with motivational posters and say, what are the goals for this party? What are we hoping to achieve? We're going to have a mid-party review. We're going to do an assessment. We're going to, that doesn't work. What he says you have to do, and you know this if you have kids, is you say, here is a line in the sand. And if you cross this, you little bastards, you die. Apart from that, have fun. And then you have things like attractors, food and games and whatever, and you see which ones work. And that's how you have to deal with complex systems, right? But very little is truly certain, because we are complex and our universe is complex as well. So uncertainty is more of a sliding scale on a personal level. What will you accept as certain for yourself? And that's quite an individual thing. Moving on to that kind of idea, you've got this line in the sand, and this is a premise of the Stoics. You actually control nothing in your life but your thoughts and your actions. Everything the other side of that line has to be okay to a degree, because you can possibly influence it at most, but you cannot control it. So again, understanding that allows you to say things outside my control will happen, and I can be resilient when they do. Saying that you are absolutely rigid and you will deal with everything as it occurs is just not possible. And, you know, this is something that's been bred into us in society. If you look at how this is very male dominated as well, the idea that you must be strong and rigid and so forth. And then look at the amount of suicides in males, especially in the West, and young males, you can see that there are correlations between the ideologies of being robust and not allowing for resilience, which is partial, you know, emotional aspects and so forth. So there's quite a lot there. And I'm aware I don't have huge amounts of time, so I'm going to skip through a few bits. You've also got the ideas of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where are you in this? And it's not a perfect thing, but it's a good baseline. You know, you can't learn and grow and evolve if you are at a baseline of I need to survive. So it's being able to find where you're comfortable and finding where you are in comfort zones, right? And you've also got the idea of psychological safety, which is very important when dealing with uncertainty. You need to be as psychologically safe as possible to be resilient. Okay, couple of the aspects here. I talked about comfort zones. There are multiple models which I've been developing on these. I think we have multiple comfort zones, and actually your optimal performance zone is not where you should spend your life. You know, you need a comfort zone because it's a place of safety and recovery. So you have to be able to move in and out of them. The movement's important. Failure as a concept of failure is wrong. Failure is telling you what you didn't do right so you can do it right next time. It doesn't mean you failed forever. And of course, the idea of feedback. We need feedback to be able to see what we've been doing wrong. And we need that to emerge from what we are doing in uncertain scenarios. So you can treat failure as a lessening, or you can treat failure as a lesson. And I've got a picture of me rock climbing there because I'm terrified of heights. I fall off all the time, and you get up and you get back on the wall and you try not to fall off again. You use what was there before, right? You just get back up and get on the wall. You haven't failed from falling off once, because everyone falls off. There's no failure in life, there's only feedback. And that's a very base part of dealing with uncertainty. So there are many types of certainty. You know, you've got internal certainty, which can help in an uncertain external world. You're looking at things like being curious and communication and collaboration, and we're explorers, we're tinkerers, we play with things. Your own integrity is a form of certainty in an uncertain world. The company that you have that does specific things and has a specific culture is a form of uncertainty. It is certainty in an uncertain market. Humans have the ability to identify and shift paradigms to identify and change patterns, right? So this is very interesting to keep in mind. The image in the middle that we have there is the idea of scaffolding. You don't have to build a rigid structure. What you can build is scaffolding, which supports the emergence of your unique architecture for your organization, for your personal life, however you're doing things. And we also deal with mental patterns where we believe that we make informed decisions and a best fit, but actually what we're doing is looking at our experience, and we create a first fit mental pattern based on emotion. Once you understand that, you can stop reacting emotively to everything in uncertainty and start exploring things and not being so afraid of the whole aspect of failure. One other thing that I'll mention is tools. We love our tools, especially in technology. Having the right tool for the right job is very important, right? But not as important as how you use it. You can use a hammer to crack open an egg, but it's probably not the best tool to do so, right? So making sure that you use these tools to your advantage and not being afraid of using other tools. That's where we fall into patterns of, I need to be agile, I need to be whatever. You know, we fall into buzzwords, we fall into quick fix ideologies. That does not help us with uncertainty, because we need to explore our own context to be able to develop our own, you know, because uncertainty is very subjective for all of us. When I talk about complexity theory, I work with Cynefin, and I've gone forward a slide. There was a bit of delay there. So I created this diagram with a couple of other guys for Cynefin 21. And you can see here the different domains that you've got. So you've got the unknowable domain of chaos. You've got the complex unknown domain where you can probe to try and find things. Then you've got the domain of complication, which is the domain of expertise, which many of us fit into. And then, of course, you've got your clear and known and familiar domain where everything is highly ordered. But the further you go into order, the more catastrophic. And you can see automation right up there at the top. If automation goes wrong, many of us have experience of that going extremely wrong. So it can be catastrophic. So resilience and agility and the ability to move between these domains, not which domain you're in, because we'll be in all of these domains at some point, but understanding that uncertainty is about moving between domains and finding new paths of certainty, I think is very, very important. So this is one of the tools that I use. And another tool that I use in business is the Remote Agility Framework, which is fantastic. It's quite new. We're currently building it at the moment. I'm a beta kind of early adopter. And it's the idea of being able to look at different types of teams, different types of management, different types of communication to fit with the new landscape of moving massively remotely or hybridized remote work, because the business landscape has drastically changed with the event of COVID, right? So we're not just dealing with uncertainty due to a virus, we're dealing with this uncertainty of business as well. You know, evolution needs to occur in companies, and a lot of companies are struggling with it. So they're falling back into patterns of command and control and various other things. So how can we deal with this stuff better? Just a recap of these bits and pieces. And everyone's welcome to this slide deck, by the way. You're more than welcome to ask me for it. You know, we do a lot of these things natively and we block ourselves from doing them. So let's learn how to learn properly again and how to do these things. And the most important thing, especially as a scuba diver, is, you know, make sure that you breathe. Stop, breathe, think, respond, have a think about things. And I'm probably roughly on time. So thank you very much for that. And I hope that it was a useful, if brief, dip into an extremely deep ocean of uncertainty.
Christopher, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. Yeah, I've just actually been informed that we've got a big problem with meetup.com. Hence why the numbers are a little low tonight. Usually, as I said to you at the beginning, we usually get 50%. So I was expecting 40 plus people tonight, but Meetup has got a problem. I have just advertised the link onto LinkedIn, but unfortunately, I think numbers are slightly lower this evening because Meetup is down, and it is still down according to my internet. So having some trouble there. But But yeah, fantastic talk, Christopher. Loved the slides. Yeah, thought that was great. But what might be a good idea is I would love to get you back and speak with us again when we have a greater audience, because I think that it is recorded, as you've mentioned there, but I think we'd really like to do yourself on that talk justice it deserves by having some more, a bigger audience here. But thank you for that. We'll talk about that in future. Okay, I'm now going to move on to our next speaker for this evening, Stan Wade. He is Head of Agile Innovation at IndigoBlue, and his talk this evening is Outcome-Driven Innovation. Stan, over to you.
Hi, so let me just see if I can get this thing to work. We had lots of fun earlier trying to get the screen sharing going. Well, I had lots of fun anyway. Clearly, I'm technically inept. So let's have a go at screen 2. Let's see if that's working. Can you see that?
Not yet. Now we can. That's good.
Great. Okay, good. Well, thanks so much for giving me an opportunity to talk about some of the stuff tonight. I feel quite passionate about it. I've had two kind of like penny drop moments in my career. One was in 1999 when I discovered what Agile was, a long time ago, and this one about 5 years ago when I kind of like understood about jobs to be done. So let's move on to what we're talking about. So jobs to be done. He says, trying to bring up the right screen for himself. Give me a second. Here we go. Right. So who am I? So I've just been doing software for an awful long time, far too long. And that's about enough about me, really. So let's talk about innovation in its own right. So innovation, I mean, the problem with innovation is everybody knows that we need it. Innovate or die, Peter Drucker. I don't know how old that is. That's a pretty ancient statement. Everybody knows that we need it. Everybody loves it. But how many people know what it really is? And if you try to go and look it up, it's actually easier said than done. So I've tried to do a little bit of research trying to find out what the best solution is. And the one that works best with me is Tony Alwick came up with this line, which is a goal of innovation is to devise a solution that addresses unmet customer needs. It's the unmet customer needs that's the important bit for me. And I want to spend basically the entire talk really looking into some of that. So let's look at the problem. So needs-based innovation. If you go to the kind of like the fundamental, just about most best practice, an awful lot of modern best practice that you're seeing actually out there in the innovation market has come from the Stanford D School. They really know their stuff. Creative design thinking, which I'm sure many of you will know. David Kelly on the picture there. You know, the guy is in so many ways has come up with so many of the great tools that we use in innovation practices today, and you can certainly learn an awful lot from these guys. You can go over to Stanford and spend, I think, some of their courses literally run many years, and they're not degrees; they're just courses. And they've got a model which they call Creative Difference. Now, Creative Difference is a framework for innovation. And I'm not going to go through all of that today because there's a lot of material in there. But I do want to look at one thing, which is the framework, part of the framework called Looking Out. And it's all about trying to understand customers and understand what your problems are. And that's really the main purpose of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, innovation. Two different ways of approaching it or thinking about it. So the first one is ideas driven. So coming up with lots of ideas and deciding how you're going to progress those. And I'd like to show you a slightly different way, which is basically needs driven. But of course, you know, as we know, it's all about ideas. So great ideas, you get lots of great ideas together, you fundamentally will come up with some fantastic innovation. That's the way we've been doing it for years, isn't it? I mean, it realistically is. And the process you go about it is you get loads of ideas together. You might have to work out a bit of a business case for testing some of those, might be a little bit of seed capital involved. You go off and develop them. And then you come up with that fantastic line of fail fast. So you try to take a large volume of ideas and just compress them down. And eventually you get one that is really brilliant and then you launch it. So I want to look on this in a couple of different ways. Let's look at this in another way. So come up with a lot of ideas. Spend some time working on it and eliminating the ones that don't have the highest potential. Then take that idea and see if it even hits the target. That just seems wrong, really. That's kind of like a ready, sort of fire, ready, aim. We're only really working out if any of these things hit the target when we've done all of the work. Okay, let's just look at it in another way, see if I can get that kind of feeling over as well. Let's assume that we own a restaurant and we want to get more customers in. Pretty good idea. So we'll make the food better. Always a good idea. So we could make a whole raft of different dishes, all the different things that we think the customer might like. And then essentially we allow people to sample those dishes. And then we ask the customers, which one do you like the most? Well, I suppose it could work. And the reason why it could work is because this is the way that the vast majority of industry actually does it. So 70%, nearly 70% of all big businesses out there, that's exactly what they do. This is their approach. Huge number of theoreticians and academics are absolutely fundamentally behind this approach. It's, some of the lines in there is quite important. Where's the one I like? It's a numbers game or something. Here we go. Successful innovation is a numbers game. So the more things you try, the more chance you'll find of finding something that works. And when I did my MBA at an Imperial, and I specialized in entrepreneurship and innovation, and this is exactly how I was trained. And my thesis was all about innovation in software, and essentially this is how it was done. I did work with Gartner, producing the academic work for some of their papers, and again, this was the way we did. There is one fundamental problem with this. It doesn't work. It's got an awful success rate. 10 to 20% of the ideas you come up with work, and the rest fail. Sucks like a Dyson. It really isn't a great way of working. And, so it's clearly not very good. And that makes me feel very sad, because suddenly I had a great idea and now I have a pretty awful idea because the return on investment is poor. Okay, so let's go through a little scenario. I want to talk to you about milkshakes. Now, here's the scenario. So a large vendor of fast food, yes, it was McDonald's, decided that they wanted to improve the sales of their milkshakes. And they went down the ideas method. They tried everything. They tried different flavors, different packaging, different pricing models, thickness, thinness, sweetness, different straws, cream with a cherry on top. They tried everything they could think of, and nothing really made any difference at all. So they were really confused. So what did they do? They went to a chap called Clay Christensen, who I'll mention a little bit later. He is an absolute guru in the innovation industry and a fantastic business personality as well. And he said, "Can you help us, Clay?" And he goes, "Yeah, okay." So he brought some people in, and they sat inside of McDonald's and they observed and they watched. And they saw two things. The first thing was people coming in at about 7:30 in the morning, very early, wearing suits, grabbing a milkshake and going out the door. Well, that was a bit weird. I wasn't expecting that. And then in the afternoon at about 4 o'clock, something else happened as well. So the door opened and these kids would drag in their mum or their carer, usually their mum, and they'd buy a milkshake and they'd all sit down at the table, and the mum would be strumming her fingers on the table, looking at her watch, and eventually they'd get up and walk away. Okay, there's a story there. So they asked the people what they were doing. So they said to the guys in the morning, people in the morning, and they said, "So that's very interesting. What job are you trying to do?" "Oh, wow." He says, "I'm about to do a long business commute. I come in here, I buy a milkshake. It kind of like keeps me entertained in the morning because I'm kind of bored driving over the same thing every day. It's like a little treat for me. Fills me up a bit. Manages to keep off the hunger pangs until midday. And yeah, that's why I do it." "So you're not really buying it because it's a milkshake?" "Well, it's convenient. Yeah. What are you buying it as?" "You're buying it as something to relieve the boredom of a car trip." So competitive products, the radio, maybe banana, maybe piece of fruit, or it was a banana, or maybe a donut, something like that, or maybe even a Mars bar. At the end of the day, the competition wasn't other milkshakes. The milkshake was kind of irrelevant. It was actually solving the problem of boredom. In the afternoon, the mums were saying a completely different story. So they said, so what, please, madam, can you tell us what job you're trying to achieve? It goes, yeah, well, I spent the entire day saying no to my kids. And this is a very, very cheap yes. It's cheap because it doesn't cost me much money, and it's cheap because it's quite quick. I wish it could be a bit quicker. So let me understand, what you're trying to do is actually basically fulfill a promise, or try to be good to your kid and make yourself feel a bit better. Yeah. So what did they do about it? Well, I'll tell you what they did. Was in the morning, they moved they had the milkshake machine quite close to the door, and they put somebody by the milkshake machine who could take money. So they could make the whole transaction very, very quickly. They also made the milkshake thicker. They made the straw thinner, and they put bits of fruit in the milkshake itself to essentially make the whole thing a better experience in a car. And they also made sure that the lid was really good and it wouldn't tip. They doubled their morning sales just by making those appropriate changes. In the afternoon, they completely changed the recipe. They made it thinner. They put a bigger straw in it, and they actually reduced the size of the cup. So essentially, the milkshake could be drunk quicker. So that made the entire obligation of being nice to their kid quicker and easier. And once again, they doubled their sales. Now, I run this as sometimes as a little exercise, and I ask people beginning up front to come up with different things that they would try. And basically, they may come up with one or two of those, but all for the wrong reasons. It's only by observing and understanding what they were doing with that milkshake and what they were trying to actually solve. That's when they understand how they can make it better. So, needs-based innovation. It's a lot more upfront thinking. So it's all about market strategy and product strategy. It's trying to find out really what the problem is. It goes back to the Einstein quote, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes understanding it and then 5 minutes coming up with a solution. So the development and the testing and the latter parts of it, they're actually not realistically the important part, because you've already got a pretty good understanding of essentially where you're going to be going. There's no randomness here. So let's go back to that model again with the ideas. So let's define what the target is first. So once we've defined the target, we can work on a significantly smaller number of ideas, because you already know what the target is, and you're pretty damn assured that you're going to be hitting a target because you already know what that target is up front. Far, far more efficient. Or if we go back to the restaurant, so do you want to create the basic meal? So the first thing you do is observe people. You observe people in the restaurant and you ask questions and you find out what they truly value. And in this particular case, you realize that it's not even the meal at all that's the thing that's bringing people in or what they value. It's actually the ambience and the whole experience. So at the end of the day, by making a completely independent issue, by maybe putting a better jazz band in or bringing in some live music, that's what makes the customer happy. And it's nothing to do with the food in the first place. All of those ideas on changing the food wouldn't have worked. So the great news is this has got a much, much better hit rate. Okay. 80% success rate. It doesn't suck. It's the way to win. Those numbers I do hold a little bit tongue in cheek, because they did come out from the organization that's promoting this, but they certainly are significantly higher. And that, of course, is a significantly better situation to be in. I'm significantly happier. And at the end of the day, I've gone from my doldrums back to something that I can understand and I can drive. It's not a new idea. This is the really funny thing is, we just had the 25th anniversary of Scrum. This started in 1962 with Ted Levitt, who was a Harvard business professor, making a very, very simple statement. People don't want a 1/4 inch drill. They want a 1/4 inch hole. And the drill is just a way of achieving that hole. And it's trying to understand what people are trying to achieve and not the mechanisms that they're actually achieving it with. Solid backing in terms of the brain, in terms of the theory behind it. So Clay Christensen, a real fan of mine. I'm a fan of his. That's better. He doesn't know who even I exist, I'm sure. But Clay is he's done so much great work in this area. You would have heard the phrase disruptive innovation. It's his phrase. He's been voted as one of the top management thinkers every year for about the last decade. And a lot of his thinking and a lot of his books directly support this way of thinking. So this jobs to be done thing, what actually is it? Well, it's essentially putting the needs first. So it's a 6-stage process. I'm not going to go into too much depth about it because I'm going to give you a way to learn all about it a little bit later. So the most important thing is to try and find out what problem we're trying to solve. So defining what the problem is, but then doing a deep dive into how people are currently solving it and asking questions, doing interviews and trying to find out what's important. And what you'll come up with those is a whole raft of what we a whole raft of items that essentially we want to maximize. They're called desired outcomes, and they're a little bit like I suppose they're a little bit like value statements. But the desired outcomes are things that you want the system to do, and you prioritize them. And you prioritize them. There's some relatively complex mathematics behind it, but there's 2 factors that go into it. The first one is how important it is, and the second one is how well that's currently serviced by other facilities. And by doing those calculations together, you can identify which ones of those are good opportunities to follow. By undertaking that, you can learn an awful lot about your market. You can understand about different market segments, and you can learn much just from the statistics of those numbers coming back. Once you've done that, you really understand what you're trying to achieve. So then you can build a product, you can come up with your ideas to give a good product market fit, and then you can move it out to the market. So this is a mechanism, a tool here where they use the opportunity landscape, which essentially is marking all those different things you might want to do and identifying which ones are worth looking at and which ones are not. So let's give you a little bit of a business example of that. So Bosch had a power saw. It was really good, but it was doing nothing in the US market, and they had no idea why. The incumbents of DeWalt and some of the others were the guys that had the entire market. So they went through the jobs to be done process, and they asked a lot of people who used the saw and tried to find out what they're trying to achieve. Found out those desired outcomes, prioritized them by the how valuable these are to you, and additionally how well they serviced. Add those 2 together, and they came up with 11 high hit items. So they got their engineers together and say, right, we've got a challenge in front of us. We've got 11 things we need to change with our saw, and here they are. They solved it in half an hour, 30 minutes. 30 minutes they had to redesign for the saw, and that's because all 11 of those items they already had solutions for. They just did not know they were important, because they did not know they were things people were looking for. They were just things they could have done. They solved it in literally in half an hour. In half an hour, they knew what they were doing. That saw has been a market leader for 10 years. So, it hit the market. So where next? I would certainly recommend any of you to go out there and pick up a copy of the Jobs to be Done book. It's easy to read, it's free, it's a PDF, you can download it. You can find it on jobstobedonebook.com, or just do a Google for Jobs to be Done book and you'll find it. It's pretty easy to read, explains a lot of the materials that I've presented to you, and hopefully, you'll get a bit of a penny drop moment as well, because I certainly did. Clay Christensen's written some fantastic stuff. The Innovator's Dilemma, that's Steve Jobs' favorite business book. And it's the Innovator's Solution, which is essentially the way that Clay solves that problem. And he's done a whole raft of other books as well. I haven't read one of his books so far that I haven't enjoyed. It's down to earth, it's practical, and it's good stuff. And the other thing you may have seen, you may have come across something called Strategizer. So Strategizer is a great business modeling tool. The value proposition canvas I'm showing you here is a way to try and work out whether your product meets market needs. And it's all based on jobs theory. So the circle on the right-hand side, that is a jobs to be done piece, a model. They do a lot lighter weight than essentially they're done by if you go through down the strategy and the jobs to be done theory, but it still does the same kind of purpose. And you'll find that the 2 organizations are very, very much in bed with each other. The jobs to be done book has got a forward by the person who owns Strategizer, and vice versa. So they know each other extremely well, and they work together very well. This is a great tool, by the way, and I'd recommend if you ever have to do any product matching that you look into using something of this nature. And that's really all I've got time for to talk about today. So I'll conclude here.
Stan, thank you very much for that. Fantastic talk. Really, really enjoyed that one. And again, as with Christopher's, it would be great to have you back when we can really give both your talks the justice they deserve and meet up on playing games with us. Okay, so I have had a couple of questions come in. Christopher, I'm going to go to you first. This question I'm about to ask is to both of you. So as you've just spoken, Stan, I'll go to you first, Christopher. How do you balance both quantitative and qualitative data in deciding what the biggest problems are to solve for your customers?
Well, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Yes, you do need to balance them. And I think that there is a massive imbalance in favor of quantitative data, certainly in business, where we are trying to, ascertain what metrics we're going to use, and we gather huge amounts of data, and you can never gather too much data, but what you can do is you can taint the data that you're gathering. So for example, you can lead it or you can change it or whatever. So what I tend to do is I tend to use methodologies that, for example, Cognitive Edge, who are the company behind Kinevin, Complex Adaptive Systems Theory, they have a method called sense making, where you are using experiences instead, and you're collecting data for experiences through narratives, and this is qualitative data, and then you are filtering it with quantitative aspects and applying that to the qualitative data. So what you are actually doing there is getting the context for why you are looking at this data, and it allows you very neutrally to then look through this data. So, for example, one of the biggest mistakes we make with qualitative type things, oh, and sorry, the other thing I was going to say was the other problem with metrics is we often A, pick the wrong ones, and B, over-focus on the metrics to the point where metrics and measurements become the goal, not a tracking of the goal or progress towards the goal we're supposed to be achieving, right? So, so when you have this narrative approach and you start looking at experiences, you use it in a very abstract way, which allows you to apply, you get a huge quantity of data and you apply qualitative context to it without the people understanding what you're doing, which means they can't tinker with the data they're giving you because they're expecting what you expect, essentially. So that's how I tend to do it. I tend to use approaches gathering experiences, which beget beliefs, which beget actions, which beget results, which hopefully are what you're aiming to get towards your goal for.
Thank you. And Stan?
Yeah.
Would you like me to repeat the question? It was to both of you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Quantitative to qualitative. Apologies. So there is actually, it's interesting because as Chris mentioned, essentially, the concept of getting the narrative and getting those stories and building it from there. It absolutely is critical that you get that, because if you ask people for specific answers, if you start diving straight into the numbers, then you will miss things. There will be things that are embedded in there. And I mentioned earlier, it's all about unmet needs, and unmet needs are kind of unknown needs quite often. You have to tease them out. Yeah, exactly. You have to tease them out. And that takes a lot of skill. It takes an awful lot of skill. I mean, if it was easy, then everybody would be able to do it. But when you're dealing with large volumes of qualitative rather, you still need to have something to be able to close it down. So certainly in the jobs to be done, there's quite a lot of maths behind it, which does give you it gives you kind of like a representative understanding from the masses. Then you begin to get the pictures. I personally think that the numbers are good for understanding some of the trends, but the real gold is found from really spending time and understanding the narrative.
Can I just add very quickly onto what Stan was saying there, because I think it's really important to understand that there are three types of reasoning that we apply when we're looking at things. And one of them is inductive reasoning, where we use conjecture, and one of them is deductive reasoning, which is what we're talking about when we eliminate, so that whatever we're left with is correct. But there's a third type we don't think about very often, and it's called abductive reasoning. And it's basically nil hypothesis reasoning, where you literally can't imagine the hypothesis you're not seeing, which is why you're not seeing it. So you need outside context and the depth of narrative.
He died.
And the big data behind those narratives people aren't seeing to get to the core. So exactly as
Is that Christopher's that's gone down, or is it mine?
I think Christopher had a glitch. He's there now.
Christopher, you didn't quite get to finish that because your internet went down.
where did I get to?
Abductive.
Hello, my name's Christopher Bramley. Oh, no.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, abductive. Okay, abductive reasoning is a nil hypothesis reasoning, where you literally can't see hypotheses that you can't imagine, because we are used to imprinting our patterns on the data that we see, so we pre-categorize. But the data has far more data than we like to look at, we see, right? So nil hypothesis abductive reasoning allows patterns to emerge from the data to tell you new hypotheses of requirements that you and nobody else have seen. So exactly as Stan says, like it's a really good way of thinking about things.
And you've got to be careful with numbers as well. I'd recommend that after you do this, go off and have a look at a site called Spurious Correlations, or just look up Spurious Correlation. Chris is laughing. And essentially you will see where two sets of data put together can clearly identify something which is very, very important. And you know, it's just nonsense. So it's very entertaining. Have a look at it. Just because the numbers say something, you've still got to use your brain to actually say, is that realistic, or is that just happen to be, coincidental?
Correlation does not equal causation. That is a very important quote to remember.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so numbers are quite low tonight, so questions are limited. So I'm going to ask you a couple that commonly come up, that have come up through our sort of weekly meetups. So Stan, I'll go to you first on this one now. Just bearing with me, sorry. How do you feel or believe that COVID-19 has affected agile ways of working? So to you first, Stan, then Christopher, jump in straight after.
It's very interesting, actually. I mean, the first thing that we found out was one of the fundamental issues of co-location, which I spent the last 15 years probably banging into people's heads and saying you get so much more efficient if you're co-located. That went out the door completely as an issue because it wasn't possible. So we should have seen a massive drop in productivity. My organization actually went up in productivity, and it's a large software development group. So that instantly put the cat amongst the pigeons in my head. That was an interesting one. And we've kind of come up with a phrase of, well, we haven't come up with, but we use the phrase no shoring. So it doesn't really matter where you live, as long as you actually have the tools to collaborate. And we've certainly used, we've started to develop, some online tools like Miro is a fantastic tool. If you never used Miro, I hadn't used it 6 months ago. I've used it a lot now. And essentially, we find that our level of collaboration has gone up because essentially, instead of having to kind of like get together into a meeting room, or, even though we know that having a chat at a monitor is probably, the right answer, the fact that you can just throw something together and have a talk about something significantly easier than before. I actually spend more time speaking to my teammates than I've ever done before. It's interesting. It's been an extremely expensive lesson for the world. But if we don't come out of this dramatically stronger in the way we work, then we're idiots, because there's been every opportunity to learn. And there are some good things that have come out of it. 1.5 billion deaths is not the good thing, but a different way of working things and actually, thinking out the box and coming up with a better, there are some things that have come out. I doubt very much if essentially the idea of the co-located team is going to be particularly easy to sell in the future. It's going to be with the right tooling. It doesn't really matter where we are.
And Christopher, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And I'd agree. I found it. So For me, it was interesting because I work a lot with culture and I work a lot with ecosystemical approaches and the idea that, bureaucracy has its place, waterfall has its place, but we've tried to apply it everywhere for so long for a number of reasons. Essentially what happened with the pandemic was not something I would have said was a crisis. It was predictable, it was predicted and simulated for a very long time, but it was ignored. What we are now seeing is the lack of resilience that was built into governmental, economical, and business systems, because we're used to just-in-time delivery patterns. We're used to, neoliberal ideas of getting as much profit out of a system, and the only value there is profit. The human side isn't valuable, blah, 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 blah. We've been moving towards, or away from those concepts for a while with kind of agile thinking, agility, not just in software development, in leadership and whatever else. But this essentially hyper accelerated the idea that, you have a contract with a company, not because you should be grateful you're working for them, but because it's a mutual contract and you should be contracted to produce outcomes for that company, not to sit there and fulfill hours worked, right? You're not meant to be there for outputs, you're there for outcomes, and the vectors that produce those outcomes are more important than, the hours that you work, essentially. So we had a really interesting juxtaposition, which I saw kind of coming, and it was very interesting to see, where we moved from the state of physical proximity in Starbucks, in the office, in whatever, where we're looking at our monitors, we're on our phones and whatever. And as soon as we were denied physical proximity, our human connection actually became much stronger. We socially noded much better. What we see now is teams that, instead of being a bunch of people in a room that a manager has dictated you talk to, although they are still a team, you find that you're actually socializing and connecting with other people in the company you normally wouldn't have. So you're essentially choosing new meta teams, if you like, or informal teams for yourself. So it's been very interesting in terms of that. So it's induced this idea of agility. It's induced an idea in some ways of equality, because the idea that, no, you have to come to the office. I don't care if you're disabled. I don't care what the problem is. I don't care. Actually, it's been proven that you don't necessarily need to be at the office, and more people are more productive at home. In fact, people are burning out. So it's introduced another very interesting agile concept, right? Where actually, if you treat people like functioning adults and the experts they are to do the job you've hired them for, they will do those jobs well. If you treat them like children and you command and control them and you constrain them, then they will game the system and they will not be interested in acting as adults. So it's been a very interesting eye-opener. And what's been as interesting is watching how many companies, like my last main client that I was with, finished with me mid-pandemic, when they hired me before the pandemic because they were in deep trouble anyway. And they said, you keep telling us to do these new things and we don't want to change anything. We just wanted a 1, 2, 3 fix. And I was like, well, those don't really exist in nature, number one. And number two, in the middle of a pandemic, I wish you all the best, good luck. And I don't think they're doing particularly well. But this is it. We fall back into these patterns. So the idea, humans are extremely, we're almost built to argue with ourselves. We've come up with a situation where for the first time, we need this outside context for innovation, disruption, and transformation. And the first thing we do is deny it and run away and fall back into default patterns because we feel we're losing control, we're losing decision-making capability, yeah. All of this kind of stuff happens. So it's been interesting, and in some ways it's been informative. And what this pandemic is not the one that we need to worry about. I mean, it's very affecting. It's had a death rate. It's had a high impact on people. It's the next one that will have a very high mortality rate that we need to prepare for. This has been actually a relatively gentle warning. We are well overdue for something like this. And it's not even about mortality rates. It's about the idea of further agility of thinking. How does this affect us? It's a novel virus. We've been given something novel that we've needed to collaborate for and produce vaccines for very quickly with huge amounts of agility and, collaboration worldwide, remotely, where we can't see each other. In some ways, it's been very binding. In other ways, it's been quite divisive. especially with political, regimes at the moment, which aren't necessarily conducive to unity. So I think it's been very interesting. In terms of Agile, I think that it has definitely accelerated I don't want to call it a mindset, the attitude of agility. But in other ways, it's kind of, clamped down on trying to hold on to the traditional stuff that doesn't necessarily work in the new landscape. So it's very interesting.
Not very agile of that company that let you go, really, was it, Chris?
Not huge.
No, it's really interesting times. I mean, Agile London and Product London are additional to my main job at Oliver Bernard, and we're a recruitment agency. Recruitment agencies historically were at your desk, client facing, meeting people, meeting clients, and that has, really had to adapt. I do agree, you do speak to people on the other side of the office a lot more now through video chats than you possibly would before. And I just think, we've all got to adapt. So yeah, thank you for your answers to you both on that one. So one final question to you both, which is always good to hear because we get a different answer every single time this question is asked, but it's always of benefit to the audience and the community. What literature can you recommend from your experience and to sort of help people grow within the Agile world? What literature can you recommend? Stan, you mentioned a book earlier, like involved in your talk. Is there anything else that you can recommend to our audience that has been, had a good impact on your Agile journey?
Yeah, so it's kind of pushing on the edge of Agile. I'll be honest with you, I don't read that many Agile books anymore because in terms of the core Agile things, they don't really have much to say anymore. But as I push the Agile boundary and move further out, I'm really a lot more into product now than I have been for a long time. And there's a book by Marty Kagan called Inspired, and I've read it 4 times, 5 times. It's just loaded. If you want to learn something about product, and it's IT product as well, Marty Kagan's from the Silicon Valley product group. It's a heavyweight book because there's so much in it. I did it on Audible. I listened to it 4 or 5 times, and it's got some great stuff in it. My CTO not retired. He left and went to. He's now doing the trace and track program as the. he's leading that. I sent him a copy of it, and as a parting gift because it's something which I really value. So Inspired by Marty Kagan. Thank
you. And Chris, just one thing. Are you trying to make a point there to your old CEO about the track and trace through that book there? he was CTO. The guy was a techie through and through, and understanding how product works was probably to his advantage. So yeah. Indeed. And Christopher?
So I'm probably not going to recommend any of my books because it seems a little unfair, but and anyway, the main one that would be relevant, I'm still writing at the moment, and a lot of the rest of them have dragons.
Feel free to plug them.
Well, I have a lot of books about dragons where I subtly slip in stuff about, complexity and random stuff about autism and loads of other things. But I would say if I was going to pick one at the moment that would be useful, I would pick one that suggests new ways of leading this, because culture is driven from the top down by leaders, but it disseminates from the bottom up for the connections between people, departments, whatever, within a company, within society, whatever, right? So culture is very interesting. And I'm not talking about cultural identity, which is a totally different thing. But the idea that even in an incredibly hierarchical, not fit for purpose traditional approach, you can actually have some immense impact. You may or may not have heard of this. Turn the Ship Around. It's a superb book. Here you go. Sorry. Right. So it's about intent-based leadership. And the idea essentially, there you go. The idea essentially is that, especially in the current climate, people actually, by and large, are not idiots and they know their jobs, right? So allowing them to have the autonomy to do stuff, to be leaders in their own right, because remember, leadership is not a role. It's been made into a role. C-suite, executives, directors are not leadership necessarily. They're upper management. It's not the same thing. They may be leaders, but they may not. Anyone with influence, usually beneficial within an organization or society, is a leader, because you are leading by example, right? So there are differences. And the idea of intent-based leadership, where everybody expresses intent and they express why they're going to do something, and everyone trusts everyone else to do something because you're part of a team and an ecosystem, actually shows that you can have hierarchical structures that work in a very ecosystemical approach, organized. I'll go into apex predator theory another time, I guess, that organized around apex predators. So it all becomes a very kind of evolving methodology for leadership and for work, and everybody is a part of the ecosystem as a whole. So I would recommend that book if you haven't read it. It's a very good book.
And I was very fortunate to meet David Marquet, and just to put a little bit more into the context of the book, this is how he actually kind of like essentially distributes command and control on an American nuclear attack submarine. Yeah. And who would ever believe you could achieve that? By the way, it's now exactly how the fleet runs across the group. But the stress was so high on him that he was given 6 months to live by the stress, and he left the Navy, and then surprisingly enough, he didn't die. But very good book, really interesting guy. I thoroughly recommend that one as well, Chris. That's a really good choice.
Yeah. And if he can do that in a highly hierarchical system like the US Navy, you can do that pretty much anywhere. So the idea of, but we're too bureaucratic. If you look at the UK, we have more bureaucracy than basically anything else on the planet. And it can work here too. It's just being able to get to the right people to get it to work.
Thank you. I was just typing that to a colleague of mine as a must read. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this week's session. So firstly, I just want to say a massive thanks to Christopher and Stan for your talks and joining us this week. Apologies, it's not our fault, but apologies that Meetup was down. We would have had much larger numbers on the session this week, but your talks were fantastic, and I'd love to get you both back and speak at another event in the very near future. So I'll reach out to you on that one. Thank you so much to everyone that joined us this evening. As I say, there's some new names here, but I can also see some absolute regulars. So thanks again for joining. These talks wouldn't happen without you, the great audience, and our great speakers. So we are back next week, so do tune in at 6 o'clock again next Wednesday. Details will be released first thing tomorrow morning onto LinkedIn. This session was recorded and will be on our YouTube page as well if you want to watch back. And do reach out to Stan and Christopher on LinkedIn, as I'm sure they'd love to continue conversations and share slides and things like that. But once again, thank you so much to everyone involved this evening. Have a nice evening, and I hope to see you next Wednesday.
Thanks, Alex.
Guys.
Thanks very much. See you guys.
Bye.